Welcome to Faith Unveiled. Today we're diving into the mystery of Peter and Paul in Rome and questioning what we truly know.
I'm excited about this discussion. There's so much to unpack about these legendary figures and their supposed ties to the eternal city.
Absolutely. It's like a detective story spanning centuries. We know Paul's Roman journey pretty well from the book of Acts. He was in Rome under arrest, appealing to Caesar, which places him in the city in the early 60s AD. But Peter, oh man, his connection to Rome is far less clear.
Right. It's interesting because while Paul writes to the Roman church, and even his letters hint at his time in captivity, there's no New Testament record of Peter actually being in Rome.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating. The earliest mention of Peter in Rome comes from the letter known as First Clement, around 96 AD, or even later if you consider some debate over dates. But even then, the details are murky at best.
It's almost like the narrative was, crafted later to boost the apostolic lineage of the Roman Church.
Yeah, like the tradition that Peter was crucified upside down, feeling unworthy to die in the same way as Jesus, while Paul was beheaded, a fate accorded to Roman citizens. These accounts pop up in texts like the Acts of Peter and the Acts of Paul, both emerging, mind you, in the late 2nd century.
That's right. And when we look at church historian Eusebius in the 4th century, he seems to neatly tie Peter's martyrdom into the narrative of Nero's persecution around 64 AD, even though his timeline often appears retrofitted to support the idea of apostolic succession in Rome.
Right, so we have this interesting interplay between historical fact and, theology. Paul in Rome feels more plausible because there's a bit more textual evidence, and even some of his letters might have been penned during his imprisonment, possibly in Rome. But Peter's story is shrouded in later tradition, which some scholars like Robert Price and Richard Carrier even argue might have been invented to give Roman bishops extra authority.
That's a bold claim. So you're saying Peter may never have even set foot in Rome? They contend that his Roman association was a later construction, meant to mirror the martyrdom and elevate the status of the church in Rome.
Exactly, and that brings us to the discussion of burial sites. Paul is traditionally linked to the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, the site believed to be built over his burial place. While for Peter, St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican is the supposed resting place. Excavations have uncovered bones beneath the altar, but the identification of those bones is frankly highly contested.
Right, and I recall that some archaeologists like Antonio Ferrua remained skeptical about the identification of Peter's bones. It seems there's a lot of evidence that's suggestive rather than definitive.
Yes, the archaeological evidence, especially for Peter, is more about, possibility rather than confirmation. There were multiple bone deposits, and the initial studies didn't conclusively prove they belonged to him. The Vatican even held on to the findings for decades before releasing any information.
Yeah, and that creates this tension between tradition and documented history. It's one thing to have a beautiful narrative about martyrdom, and another when the evidence is basically circumstantial at best.
Precisely, and that's the core of the debate. Let's talk about the dating and sources review. The tables from the research show that the confidence in Paul's presence in Rome is moderate, mainly based on Acts and his own letters. But for Peter, especially his upside-down crucifixion, the source is the Acts of Peter from the late 2nd century, casting his story into the realm of legend.
Right. I think it's somewhat ironic, isn't it? We have one figure, Paul, whose historical footprint is relatively stronger. And then there's Peter, whose powerful legacy might be more, say, constructed to serve a theological purpose.
Yeah, it's like the evidence for Paul was written closer to the actual events, while Peter's story seems to have been elaborated on later. drawing on elements that mirror the narrative of Jesus' passion. It's almost like a crafted myth to imbue the Roman Church with apostolic prestige.
But here's a thought. Don't you think there's still some validity in the idea? Even if the evidence is thin, that traditions hold symbolic truth, even if they're not strictly historical?
That's a fair challenge. Look, traditions, by their nature, carry meaning. The powerful imagery of two martyrs who laid down their lives in Rome speaks to the identity of the church. But as historians, we need to separate the layers of narrative from hard evidence.
Right. Exactly. So while the story is compelling and gives a sense of sacred heritage to Rome, the actual documentation, especially for Peter, remains sketchy.
Yes, and then there are the alternate theories. Some scholars even suggest that Paul's death might have occurred in Spain after an alleged missionary trip, though that claim, like much of Peter's tradition, is derived from later legends rather than the New Testament.
So it constantly seems like later generations were crafting these stories, huh? Maybe to create a sense of unity and continuity in a time when the church needed strong symbols.
Precisely. It's like they were stitching together a narrative that would serve both religious and political needs. And you see that in how Eusebius's accounts are, to some extent, colored by theological motives, making the timeline fit the idea of a sanctified Roman church.
Yeah, exactly. That makes me wonder about how we balance the historical lens with the spiritual or symbolic meaning these narratives hold for people.
It's a tough balance. On one hand, we're looking for concrete evidence, like actual timelines and verified burial sites, and on the other, we recognize that stories, myths, traditions, they often carry as much weight as hard facts in terms of cultural and spiritual significance.
And that duality is what makes discussions like these so fascinating. It's like, a blend of detective work and philosophical inquiry.
Exactly. It's all about digging into what history tells us versus what tradition wants us to believe. The script we're looking at pushes us to ask, what do we really know? It challenges the notion that Peter and Paul's martyrdom in Rome is an indisputable fact, urging us to consider the possibility that these narratives were,
Right.
in some respects, intentionally constructed.
It almost feels like a case study, where the evidence is deliberately scattered so that both skepticism and belief can coexist.
Yeah, it's like a layered puzzle. On one layer, we have the historical fragments. Paul's journey to Rome is relatively well attested, while Peter's journey remains more of a tradition than a documented event. On another layer, we see that archaeology, especially with burial sites, provides suggestive but inconclusive evidence.
And then you have the tables that break down the confidence in various claims. The moderate confidence in Paul's Roman presence versus the low or legendary level of detail for Peter really underlines the difference in their historical records.
Right. And it's that disparity that fuels alternate theories. Some propose that Peter's Roman connection might be a later invention, that its primary purpose was to, bolster the legitimacy of the church in Rome by linking it directly to the apostles.
Yeah, but I have to respectfully challenge a point here. Even if the narrative was somewhat constructed, doesn't the impact of these traditions on believers and church history count for something? I mean, the symbolism is powerful.
Absolutely, and I agree with you on that. It is a valid critique. The resonance of these stories, even if they aren't historically airtight, has shaped the religious landscape in profound ways. The symbolic truth can be just as important as the factual truth for many people.
Exactly. So while we're critical of the historical methodology, we also acknowledge that these narratives have been vital in shaping identity and faith over the centuries.
Yes, and looking at it this way, it's a bit like art. Sometimes the story's beauty and the meaning it conveys override the need for precise factual documentation. especially when that narrative offers a kind of connection to a grand
Right.
past.
It's fascinating how the quest for truth can lead us down so many winding roads, from hard historical evidence to much more interpretive and symbolic narratives.
Definitely. And at the end of the day, the bottom line from our discussion is that while Paul's Roman presence has a stronger footing in early sources, Peter's connection is far more ambiguous, largely resting on later tradition and, frankly, on a need to fortify Rome's status in early Christianity.
And that leaves us with a reminder. In theological history, sometimes the allure of a story can be as compelling as the facts themselves. Even if the evidence doesn't lay it all out neatly, the impact of these legends continues to shape beliefs and identities.
Exactly. It's a powerful reminder to always question, to always look deeper at how narratives are constructed, not to debunk them entirely, but to understand the layers of human motivation behind them.
Absolutely. Well, this has been quite the exploration, blending history, archaeology, and a bit of myth-making. I think our listeners now have plenty to think about regarding Peter and Paul's legacies in Rome.
For sure. Thanks for joining in on this deep dive into faith and history. Until next time, keep questioning and exploring the layers of our past.